The training grounds of the Blackthorn pack were quiet that morning, except for the sound of boots on packed dirt and the low murmur of wolves gathering to watch. Lyra Ashwood stood at the center of the circle, her hands trembling at her sides, while dozens of eyes studied her like she was already a disappointment waiting to happen. She was used to it. She had been used to it for as long as she could remember. Lyra had been found as a pup, alone in the woods bordering Blackthorn territory, with no parents, no pack mark, and no explanation. The Blackthorn Alpha at the time had taken her in out of duty rather than kindness, and she had grown up inside the pack house like a guest who never quite belonged. Other wolves shifted easily by the time they were children. Lyra never had. Not once. Not even a flicker of fur or a glimpse of golden eyes beneath her own. They called her the Hollow Girl behind her back, sometimes to her face. Today was the seasonal trial, a ceremony where every young wolf demonstrated their strength before the pack elders. It was supposed to be simple. Focus. Breathe. Let the wolf inside rise to the surface. For everyone else, it took seconds. For Lyra, it had never happened at all. She closed her eyes and tried anyway, the way she always did, silently begging some silent thing inside her to answer. Nothing came. Just the same aching stillness she had felt her entire life, like knocking on a door no one would open. A low, unimpressed voice cut through the crowd. "Is this a joke?" Lyra's eyes snapped open. Standing at the edge of the circle, arms crossed, was Alpha King Draven Nightshade, ruler of the Nightshade Pack and the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. He had arrived days earlier to negotiate an alliance between their packs, and his presence had turned Blackthorn upside down with nerves and formality. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man who had never once doubted his own power. He was also, Lyra had quickly learned, entirely without patience for weakness. "She can't shift," someone murmured behind him, as if explaining an obvious flaw. Draven's gaze swept over Lyra, cold and assessing, the way a man might look at a broken tool before tossing it aside. "Then why is she standing in my circle, wasting my time?" The words landed like a slap. Lyra felt her face burn, felt every set of eyes in the clearing shift toward her, waiting to see how she would break. She wanted to disappear into the ground. Instead, she lifted her chin, because if there was one thing life had taught her, it was how to endure being looked at like she was less than nothing. "She's been trying for years," said Elder Mabel gently, stepping forward as if to soften the moment. "Her bloodline is unknown. It's possible her wolf is simply non-existent," Draven finished flatly. "A wolf who cannot shift is not a wolf. She's a liability wearing a pack mark she didn't earn." He turned to the Blackthorn Alpha with visible disdain. "I question the judgment of a pack that allows dead weight to stand among warriors." Laughter rippled through part of the crowd, quiet but unmistakable. Lyra didn't cry. She had trained herself long ago never to cry in front of people who wanted to see it. She simply turned and walked out of the circle, her spine straight, her hands curled into fists, while Draven's words echoed behind her like a brand burned into her skin. That night, she sat alone at the edge of the forest, in the one place that had always felt different to her, a grove of ancient twisted trees the pack avoided out of superstition. The elders called it cursed. Lyra had never felt anything but calm there, as if the trees recognized her even when no one else did. She pressed her palm against the bark of the oldest tree and closed her eyes. "What's wrong with me?" she whispered, the way she had 1,000 times before. "Why won't you come?" For the first time in her life, something answered. It wasn't words. It was a pulse, deep and slow, like a heartbeat buried far beneath the earth, rising up through her palm and into her chest. Her breath caught, her vision blurred at the edges, and for one dizzying second, she saw gold eyes staring back at her from the darkness behind her own eyelids. Ancient, patient, and enormous, nothing like the sleek young wolves of her pack. Then it was gone, as quickly as it came, leaving her gasping and alone in the dark. She told no one. Who would believe her? The Hollow Girl, claiming she'd felt something stir inside her, the same night the Alpha King had called her worthless in front of everyone. They would say grief was making her imagine things. But she went back to the grove every night after that. Over the following weeks, the alliance talks between Blackthorn and Nightshade stretched longer than anyone expected. filled with tense negotiations over territory lines and hunting rights. Draven remained a near-constant presence in the pack house, his sharp eyes missing nothing, his tongue just as sharp when Lyra crossed his path. "Still here," he said once, passing her in the hallway, not quite a question. "Still breathing," she replied before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, that she'd answered at all. Most wolves lowered their eyes around him. Lyra never had, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd learned that fear only fed cruelty like his. He said nothing else, but she caught him watching her more than once after that, his expression unreadable, as if she were a puzzle he resented not being able to solve. She didn't know that Draven had grown up the same way she had, unwanted, tested, and mocked, before he clawed his way into power through sheer force of will. She didn't know that her refusal to break reminded him of a version of himself he'd buried a long time ago. All she knew was that his eyes lingered longer than his insults did, and that confused her more than the insults ever had. The peace between the packs shattered on a night no one saw coming. It began with the horn, the old warning call that hadn't sounded in Blackthorn territory in over a decade. Lyra woke to chaos, the pack house emptying into the yard as warriors shouted orders, and wolves shifted mid-stride, racing toward the tree line where firelight flickered unnaturally against the dark. The Ashen Claw pack had crossed the border in force, striking while both packs were distracted by alliance talks, their numbers greater than anyone had prepared for. Screams and snarls tore through the night air. Lyra, unable to shift, unable to fight, was swept along in the panic, with nothing but her bare hands and her racing heart. She found herself separated from the others, near the edge of the grove, the fighting closing in around her from every direction. A massive Ashen Claw wolf broke through the trees, teeth bared, eyes locked on her with predatory focus. She stumbled backward, tripped over a root, and hit the ground hard, her breath knocked out of her. This is it, she thought, staring up at the creature advancing on her. This is how it ends, not as a warrior, not as anything at all. Somewhere nearby, Draven was fighting 3 wolves at once, his movements brutal and precise, when he caught sight of her through the chaos, small, defenseless, cornered. Something in his chest twisted violently, sharp and unfamiliar, and he realized with sudden, sickening clarity that if she died tonight, it would be partly because he had spent weeks convincing everyone, including her, that she wasn't worth protecting. Lyra. His voice tore across the clearing, raw in a way it had never been before. He was too far. He knew it even as he fought toward her, throwing off his attackers with desperate force, watching the Ashen Claw wolf lunge toward the girl he had called worthless only weeks before. And then everything changed. Lyra felt it before she understood it, a rising heat beneath her skin, the same pulse from the grove, but no longer distant or hesitant. It surged upward from somewhere impossibly deep inside her, a wave of pressure and heat and pure, ancient power, as if a door that had been locked her entire life had finally been thrown open. She didn't decide to change. Her body simply answered a call it had been waiting years to hear. Bones shifted with a sound like thunder rolling through her chest. Her spine arched, her limbs reshaped themselves in a blinding rush of silver light, and where a frightened, cornered girl had been kneeling in the dirt, there now rose a wolf unlike anything Blackthorn or Nightshade had ever seen. She was massive, larger than any wolf in either pack, her fur a deep, shifting silver that seemed to hold its own faint glow, her eyes burning gold with an intelligence and age that belonged to something far older than a single lifetime. The Ashen Claw wolf froze mid-lunge, some ancient instinct screaming at it to retreat. It was too slow. Lyra moved with a speed and precision she had never possessed, driven by instincts that felt inherited rather than learned, and threw the attacking wolf aside as though it weighed nothing at all. The clearing fell silent, save for the sound of fighting elsewhere in the trees. Every wolf near enough to see stopped, frozen by the sight of her, the Hollow Girl, the wolf who couldn't shift, standing in a form none of them had names for. Draven stood frozen among them, blood on his fur, breath ragged, staring at the creature that had once been the girl he mocked. He had fought beside legends and faced alphas twice his size without flinching, but nothing had ever silenced him the way this did. Lyra turned toward the remaining invaders, and something in her ancient gaze made even the fiercest Ashenclaw warriors hesitate. She moved through them with controlled, terrifying grace, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct, protecting the pack that had spent years telling her she didn't belong. Because some part of her, older than her own memory, understood duty in a way none of them had ever taught her. Within minutes, the Ashenclaw forces broke and fled back across the border, leaving Blackthorn territory bloodied but standing. Wolves who had mocked Lyra for years now stared at her in stunned, reverent silence as she slowly shifted back, collapsing to her knees in the dirt, human once more, trembling from the force of what had just happened inside her. Draven reached her first. He knelt in front of her, careless of the mud and blood soaking his knees, his usual composure completely gone. Lyra. Her name came out rough, almost unrecognizable in his mouth. "What are you?" She looked up at him, exhausted and shaking, but unbroken in a way that had nothing to do with strength anymore. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I never knew." It was Elder Mabel, arriving breathless with the pack historian close behind her, who finally gave the answer none of them expected. Ancient texts, nearly forgotten, spoke of a bloodline older than any current pack. The first wolves, ancestors to every alpha line in existence, thought extinct for centuries. A silver coat, golden eyes. Power that surfaced not through training, but through will, and only in moments when the soul itself refused to break. Lyra was not hollow. She had never been hollow. She had simply been waiting, buried beneath fear and mockery, for a moment desperate enough to finally set her free. In the days that followed, everything shifted, just as she had. Wolves who had once looked past her now lowered their eyes out of respect rather than dismissal. The Blackthorn Alpha, humbled and shaken, formally apologized for years of neglect. And Draven, the Alpha King who had once called her a waste of a bloodline in front of the entire pack, stood before her in the same clearing where he'd humiliated her, and did something no one had ever seen him do before. He knelt. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "I judged you before I understood you, and I let my own arrogance decide your worth. That was my failure, not yours." He looked up at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to hear it. From me, in front of everyone who heard me tear you down." The old Lyra might have accepted the apology quietly, grateful simply to be seen. But she wasn't that girl anymore. Not entirely. She studied him for a long moment, aware of every eye in the clearing watching to see what the last of the first wolves would do with the king who had once mocked her. "You'll have to earn it," she said finally, her voice calm but unwavering. "Not with words, with time." A slow, unexpected smile crossed Draven's face, more genuine than anything Lyra had seen from him since his arrival. "Then I intend to have a great deal of time," he said. The alliance between Blackthorn and Nightshade was rewritten in the weeks that followed, but not on the terms either pack had originally imagined. Lyra Ashwood, once dismissed as the weakest wolf in her pack, now stood as something closer to legend, her bloodline older and more powerful than any alphas before her. The girl who had once knelt in humiliation in that same circle now walked through it with quiet authority, unshaken by whispers, because she finally understood that her strength had never needed anyone else's permission to exist. She had simply been waiting for the world to be ready to see it.